Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sanjana Lahiri, and I'm the chair of the Student Lecture Series Committee here at the Cooper Union's Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture. Tonight, we're delighted to be joined by Caitlin Taylor. Caitlin is an architect at MUSE Design Group with a background in agriculture. She brings to the firm an interdisciplinary focus on environmental, economic, and social justice in the food system. She directs the Food System Design Lab at MUSE and is currently leading projects around the country, including the operational design of the public market in Poughkeepsie, the Good Shepherd Conservancy in Kansas, kitchen design guidelines at the Brigaid School, and a temporary installation in Columbus, Indiana. Prior to joining MUSE, Caitlin led an independent practice focused on water infrastructure. In this capacity, she received the Holcim Foundation for Sustainable Construction Gold Prize for her work on urban flood control in Las Vegas. Caitlin lives with her family in Connecticut, where they own and operate an organic vegetable and cut flower farm. She's taught advanced architecture studios at the YSOA and Columbia GSAP, and is currently teaching an option studio at Cornell University. Caitlin studied biochemistry at Wesleyan University and received her Master's of Architecture at the Yale School of Architecture. She's a registered architect with licenses in Connecticut and Massachusetts. As always, I'd like to thank Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown for their continued support of the Student Lecture Series. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Caitlin Taylor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for that lovely welcome, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. I'm thrilled to be Zooming into this lecture series. As you mentioned in my wonderful introduction, my name is Caitlin Taylor. I'm the design director of the Food Lab within MUSE Design Group, and I'm zooming in today from my very old farmhouse in East Haddam, Connecticut. I feel like it's more important than ever in this moment of really profound isolation and upheaval that we do our very best to locate ourselves, ground ourselves, and connect with each other however we can. So I've been trying to do that more intentionally on Zoom recently. So I'm here in this very chilly room with no insulation in East Haddam, Connecticut, in a house that was built in 1693 on my farm, where the leaves have mostly fallen and the chicory crop is happily growing today through the colder and colder nights. So I hope that everybody finds themselves in places that are warm and nourishing this evening. So, with that, and by way of a very personal introduction, as was mentioned, I'm an architect by training, but I'm also a farmer by profession and technically a biochemist by education. So I come to my work at MUSE with an interdisciplinary focus on food at the intersection of our built and unbuilt environments. I work on food through the lenses of science and farming and design. So I'm going to talk today about why I think food is such a powerful agent of change in the world, and specifically why I think that the architecture discipline must be in dialogue with our food systems. And I'll also talk about how that strong belief of mine has manifest as a portfolio of research and design projects and some ongoing long-term partnerships within MUSE as an organization. So first, I'll just give a really quick 2-minute introduction about my background and about MUSE as a global practice before we dive deeper into the Food Lab portfolio and its conceptual framework. So as you know from the intro, I come to my work with a pretty atypical background of being both an architect and a farmer. I started my farm with my husband and our 2 business partners to steward a piece of earth with this hunch that the intersection of food and architecture is like fertile ground, no pun intended. But the business of my farm is also that it's a business that I run with my husband and our 2 best friends who are also our business partners. And our farm is pretty tiny by national standards, but it's actually really medium-sized by Northeast standards. This is my son Ellis, who's now 5. We grow super diversified organic fruits, vegetables, and cut flowers, and that means that we are regularly every season trialing over like 250 varieties of vegetables and 150 varieties of cut flowers. And we have built our cooperative ownership structure here on the farm on principles of ecological health and long-term investment in our soil and in land stewardship. So though I live year round on my farm in Connecticut, I work as a design director within the global architecture and design collective that is MUSE Design Group. We are a nonprofit architecture firm, a nonprofit design collective. We're the largest nonprofit architecture firm in the world by like a lot. And in the last 13 years, MUSE has grown from a team of 2, sometimes 4, to an international firm of about 130 people or 135 people spread out around the world. We have offices in Kigali, Rwanda, Boston, Massachusetts, Poughkeepsie, New York, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we have small satellite offices also in South Africa and London. We're a team comprised of architects and landscape architects and engineers and researchers and artists and writers and planners. We have a portfolio of really diverse projects around the world at lots of different scales in healthcare and hospitals, in affordable senior housing in Boston, in housing on native and tribal lands, on conservation projects, a big ecological work, monuments and memorials. But the through line that connects our super diverse portfolio of work is this fundamental belief in architecture as a tool for justice and a sort of unyielding commitment to provenance in our work. We fundamentally believe at MUSE that architecture is never neutral, that every design decision that we make is imbued with meaning. And our mission, therefore, as a mission-driven organization, is to research, build, and advocate for architecture that promotes justice and dignity. So we recognize in that work that the built environment is responsible for either preserving the status quo or promoting systemic cultural change, and promoting systemic change in who has power and why, and who builds and what they build and why. So we dedicate ourselves to work that first seeks to listen and learn and understand, and then to act as like an active agent of healing injustice that has been codified or hardened in bricks and roof lines and our built and unbuilt world throughout history. So with that, I'm gonna briefly talk about how I position food in the world and in my brain and what that has to do with architecture. I come to my work with the sort of core belief that food impacts everything around us, ecologically, economically, culturally, epidemiologically, historically. Food really literally shapes the world that we live in. And the food system counts as stakeholders, literally every person on earth who eats every day. Our industrialized and globalized system, the one that feeds most of us, most of our food most days, is built on the foundations of commodification and capitalism and systemic racism and efficiency at all cost. It's built on foundations of unjust labor practices and ecological degradation. And it's built, our industrial global food system is built so far outside of the natural limits of bioregional economies or ecologies that it is by definition a machine fueled by vast injustice. The food system is the world's largest employer, about over 1 billion people working every day to grow, process, transport, market, cook, pack, sell, and deliver food. And the resources required to sustain that system are obviously vast. About 50% of the habitable land area on Earth is taken up in agricultural production, about 70% of the world's fresh water. And 3/4 of the world's food that is eaten every day comes from just 12 plant and 5 animal species. So diets around the world are increasingly homogeneous and comprised of mono diets of mega crops like wheat, rice, corn, soybean, and palm oil. And the lack of diversity in our industrialized monocultural production system is the definition of something that is super fragile, right? When warming temperatures or a single pest or disease can destroy whole swaths of our supply chain in one fell swoop, that system is incredibly vulnerable. We've seen that regularly in the last few months as the COVID pandemic has spread around the world. 70%, about 70% of all methane greenhouse gas emissions and about 40% or 40 something percent of all the calories grown in the world are to feed livestock or go to waste. And, I'll just, I guess, maybe say before I transition to talking more specifically about architecture that it's easy to get really disturbed when looking closely at the industrial food system. What we see when we look at it head on is a system of colonialism and capitalism and slavery and genocide and disease and famine and imperialism. And those things are all violent tools in the tool belt of the corporations that, quote unquote, feed the world. So, but, I come to my work with the belief that we have to look straight at it in order to understand how to undo it. And in order to do that, we need to understand that collective cooking and eating is a spiritual act, but modernization has brought all of these systems of imperialism that I just described, capitalism, colonialism, gentrification, to bear on really deep and rich cultural heritage, and that has served to remove meaning and memory from culinary traditions. And we have to understand that systemic classism and racism have made fast food chains more common than grocery stores in so many cities. So poor people and people of color disproportionately suffer under the strain of poor diets with lower life expectancy today than their parents. And we have to understand that the farming and fast food industries are responsible for a disproportionate rise in income inequality and unjust labor practices. And, so many countless lives are characterized by displacement, by migration, by loss of land and loss of sovereignty and loss of control over resources and loss of a shared cultural table. So given that relatively dire picture, I want to sort of ask the question and then try to answer it that, about what food has to do with architecture, what exists at the relationship between food and architecture. So I believe that food and architecture are both really powerful and really profound ways of making the invisible visible. Cuisine and buildings both serve to make our values as people, as communities, as societies, as cultures, really visible or tangible or material. So the slow food movement was and is a step towards resetting the values of our global food system towards place-based and ecologically driven cuisine that values people and provenance over efficiency and growth. But we really desperately need that same slow food movement in architecture. And I'll talk a little bit about that. We're in this moment of really profoundly accelerating crises. We're facing accelerating and converging crises of climate change, planetary warming, racial injustice, capitalism and economic inequality, global pandemic. And we know that the modern industrial food system is this machine, as I mentioned, that is calibrated, this vast machine that is calibrated for homogeneity and efficiency and compliance and infinite growth, which we know to be against the laws of nature, and incalculable profit. So we acknowledge that the food system is a placeless embodiment of opaque global supply chains, and it's an infrastructure of injustice. I think it's a war fought against regional and cultural meaning. I think the food system is a source of pandemic and plague. It's an economic race to the bottom. And we know in the midst of these converging crises that the production and consumption of food lies at the kind of intersection or the epicenter of the path that we're on. It lies at the convergence of culture and environment and of buildings and infrastructure. So I want to just quickly talk about what the sustainability discourse means within the architecture profession in regards to this conversation about food systems. As sort of an aside, I think that in much the same way as descriptions of healthy, quote unquote, healthy food in the grocery store so often disguise the vast untold degradation of land, people, animals, ecosphere that were necessary to supply it. Sustainable, quote unquote, is a similarly hollow descriptor of anything even remotely just or regenerative or resilient or even literally sustainable about our built environment. So like the new Apple headquarters seen here, which is, being heralded as the greenest building on the planet. But in fact, it exists at the end of a long and brittle supply chain that focuses on super rigid performance metrics over provenance. And contemporary sustainable building practices are defined by these rigorous environmental metrics of performance, but with a super narrow understanding of what the impact is of striving for perfection. So architects are designing and building so-called perfect machines, but the question, I think, is at what cost? So the supply chain that has grown up around the sustainable building industry is incredibly opaque and diffuse, like the industrial food system, and has so rapidly come to life in the same decades. Buildings and infrastructure have become placeless embodiments of these opaque global supply chains rather than testaments to the ecological, social, cultural, and economic landscapes in which they are situated. And I want to just say here for a moment that the industrial scale food infrastructure that we have in today's world is invisible by design, right? Like the capitalist machine in which our food system is embedded, which is performing exactly the way that it was designed to perform. And in that same way, it's not an accident that our food infrastructure blends into the kind of even spread logistics of our national infrastructural web and in no way reflects the places in which it is embedded. I think we could say about it that it is the same everywhere and therefore belongs nowhere. And yet there is another way, right? We know there's another way. We at MAS are inspired by and grounded by and motivated by the idea that we can design and build architecture that can only exist in its specific time and its specific place. We believe in an architecture of constraints and an architecture of limits. So thankfully, the material life of our built environment as it relates to this conversation is finally being called into question industry-wide, thanks in part, in small part, to a kind of disruptive or insurgent group of troublemakers within MAS, which I'm proud to be a small part. I think that whereas the architecture and construction industries have traditionally been sold falsehoods about the absolute importance of operational carbon, the energy required to run a building over time and how to use technology to use less energy. We're now understanding more and more, I'm sure that you all are learning about this in your courses, about the energy required to extract, source, and transport building materials, which we now know to call embodied carbon. And thank goodness, our deep dive on this issue within MAS has started to ground, literally and figuratively, ground our buildings and our infrastructure in place. So we are now, as a firm and as a discipline, understanding with more and more clarity, I hope, that building our human life, that bringing our human life unearth back within reasonable limits is not something that we can do purely with or only with technological or technocratic solutions, but it's going to require place-based, regional, and diverse and perennial structures, perennial design ideas. So as part of an emerging conversation in the building trades about embodied carbon, I think we have to ask on every project that we work on, what else is also embodied in the decisions that we make about our built environment? How do we give our deeply held values, material logic, and spatial form? I think we need to ask how we root our infrastructure in time and in place, and recalibrate the space that our stuff takes up, literally. And I'm really curious in all of my work and all of our work as a firm about how we do that, from the scale of a table to the scale of a person to the scale of a building. I'm really curious about how form can follow function at the scale of an ecosystem, or even better, at the scale of an economy. And so, I hope that our work reflects a deep commitment to the question of what architecture has to offer to the, in my case, specifically to the urgent redesign of just and equitable food systems that are regional and bounded. So the food lab portfolio and the projects that I will share quickly now are some of the ways that we are trying to answer these questions. I hope that whirlwind trip through our approach to design at Mass and the conceptual framework for my work within the firm will hopefully frame why I think this is such an urgent conversation for architects to jump into. But as a transition to some projects, I'll just quickly say one more thing, which is that, a way of describing how we think about the work we do at Mass that I think is relevant here, because even before this food lab portfolio came into itself in the last few years, we were already calling our work at Mass the slow food movement of architecture. So what do we mean by that, really? I want to just pause here before I move on to projects. The slow food movement, as I'm sure you all know, was founded to preserve regionally diverse food systems and to reconnect the act of eating to the source of the food and to the methods of growing it, reconnect the act of eating to the people that raised it, to the cultural memory of how it's prepared. And as we've industrialized our food system and therefore outsourced the decisions about our infrastructure to corporations, so too have we industrialized our building industry insofar as we have displaced the decision-making power from the communities that are most impacted by our work. So when we use the slow food movement as an analogy for what we do at Mass, what we mean is that we approach all architecture, not just within the food lab, but across the wide range of projects that we work on, from the perspective of reconnecting the process of building to the people that the buildings serve. We approach architecture from the perspective of refocusing on the cultural and spiritual act of building, and to very specifically celebrate regional variation and provenance. And I hope that you'll see that in our work. So I'm going to just quickly run through a couple of projects at a range of scales to introduce how we think about these things in a project specific and a partner specific way. And then I will wrap up in about probably 15 minutes and we'll have time for some questions. I want to make sure there's time for discussion and questions at the end. So this is a project called the Hudson Valley Farm Hub. The Farm Hub is a 1,200 acre educational farm in Kingston, New York. Their mission as an organization is to build an equitable and ecologically resilient farm economy in the Hudson Valley. We, based in our office in Poughkeepsie, have been participating actively in this regional conversation for years, but it has really kind of come to a boil here during the pandemic. And so we are working very closely with the Farm Hub and other partners to identify infrastructural gaps that we can fill actively together as a regional coalition. But in this place, on this campus, we have partnered with the Farm Hub organization to plan and design an entirely new campus from scratch, basically. And the hard question here that we are working on answering with them is how the buildings and the campus as a whole can realize their educational goals in ways that are both aspirational and attainable and transferable. So that is especially relevant to the ecological performance of the buildings, their integration into the larger landscape, and the way that they serve as teaching tools. To quickly go to another continent, Western African grain production is a hot topic of conversation in the international food world right now. And fonio is a specific type of grain. It's like quinoa. It's traditionally grown in the Sahel region of Western Africa. It has fallen out of contemporary production primarily because processing by hand is really difficult, and/or is reliant on these really slow and inefficient and heavy mobile mills. So the design of a specialized industrial scale Fono Mill in Senegal will support a beneficial supply chain by reducing the bottleneck of pre-industrial processing, recruiting and training smallholder farmers to increase their yields and maximize productivity, and will then subsequently bolster a regional food economy by supporting farmers and reducing their reliance on importing white rice and other grains. So because fonio is a particularly drought tolerant crop, a vibrant fonio industry will provide a really clear and powerful example, we hope, of the role that resilient agriculture and regenerative agriculture can play in combating desertification and climate change in the dramatically, rapidly changing ecosystems of the Sahel. So we've partnered with an organization called Yolele. They are really inspiring, run by an amazing chef named Pierre Chiam, who has 2 restaurants in New York. You should go if you're in New York, to develop the conceptual design of the Fono Mill. And our initial design work, which is ongoing, has enabled conversations with investors about the potential of this industrial scale mill to combine the operational efficiency of a prefabricated mill system with the cultural, environmental, and ecological intelligence of something that is locally fabricated. So it's an example of how we work to reconcile those 2 things. So to come back to this continent and change dramatically in scale, in 2019, MASS was awarded the Irwin and Xenia Miller Prize in Columbus, Indiana. Columbus, Indiana, for those of you who don't know or haven't been, is a really strange and wonderful small city of about 45,000 people, I think. And the city has, thanks to the interest of one really wealthy industrialist family through the last 100 years, invested in the design services of some of the most famous architects in the world to design civic buildings. So it's a really interesting place to practice architecture. But anyway, we were awarded the Miller Prize last year to design and build a temporary installation in downtown Columbus. So what are we going to do? Of course, we're going to plant a cornfield. Our project, which we called Cornmeal, spatializes our American landscape of corn production and defamiliarizes, or tries to defamiliarize, the really ubiquitous cornfield for students and the visiting public, people that visit the installation, in order to redraw a more proximate and direct relationship between the vast landscape of corn production and the sort of in the scale of a human. So as you all may know, just as an aside, corn maintains this like super outsized influence on our national food system, on our economy, on what stocks our grocery store. But of course, it's also a very crucial crop for Indigenous and First Nation farmers working to maintain self-determined biodiversity and food sovereignty. So adjacent to the Central Middle School campus in Columbus, we planted about 9,000 corn plants around a central clearing, and through varying the types of corn and therefore the heights of the plants themselves, the fields landscape communicated, or the sort of didactically communicated, the usage of corn production in US industries, and literally and figuratively centers our country's indigenous history of corn production. So just as an example, our country grows about 88 million acres of corn every year, and only 1.5% is directly eaten by people. So to mirror that statistic, the 1% of the corn planted at the installation stands alone in the center clearing, marking the gathering place for community meals. And when visitors attended those community meals last fall, they harnessed the transformative power of a shared table, and subsequently cultivated regional food literacy. I am just going to share a couple other projects before I stop talking. So this is Frank Reis, who lives in Lindsborg, Kansas, which is very, very rural and remote central Kansas in the Flint Hill Prairie. I met Frank through a sort of small world connection, sort of like a mutual friend, long story short. And he was talking about his desire to build an educational center on his farm. And I said, it sounds like he needs an architect. And, the rest is history. So Frank is a 4th generation Kansan poultry farmer who has spent his life preserving and protecting the genetic biodiversity of heritage and standard bred poultry on his very humble yet like truly exceptional farm in Lindsborg. So, as I introduced in the beginning of my talk, we've established that the industrialized food infrastructure or production machine is a hugely destructive force. And in my introduction, I didn't even really touch on the fact that on factory farming of animals, which is really one of the, it's like truly one of the horrors of our modern world. Within the context of industrialized animal farming, confined animal feeding operations, 99% of all land animals that are killed are farmed birds. And of those 99%, 99.9% are factory farmed. So incredibly, today, there are two corporations that own over 75%, I think, of the genetics for all broiler chickens on the planet. And this factory system, of course, has had very extreme impacts on rural communities. So as production doubles and doubles and doubles again on these monocultural farms, the small towns of rural America are isolated by more and more miles of grain grown mostly to feed livestock. These towns and these communities become casualties to this vast commodity market that has no real use for actual human farmers. And in the midst of the near total industrialization of poultry farming in America, where farmers are no more than expendable sharecroppers who own nothing but their own massive debt, and deep in the landscape of remote rural central Kansas, Frank is doing something really different. He is, by many accounts, literally the last independent poultry farmer operating at his scale left on the planet. He's a national leader. He's considered like the definitive expert on heritage breeding. He maintains many breeds of turkeys, ducks, and chickens that have not been saved anywhere else on Earth. And he sells only certified USDA heritage poultry. He sells the only certified USDA heritage poultry in the world. And he has long maintained a dream of building an educational institution on his farm to teach a whole new generation of farmers to do what he does. He turned 74 this year and feels a real sense of urgency around this mission. and I think it's worth asking or worth reminding ourselves what would be lost if we failed here. He recognizes that his work is the insurance policy against the long history and heritage of American poultry farming and what has been brought onto it by the industrial CAFO system. So his work really provides a viable alternative to the industrial system. So we have partnered with Frank to build an educational institute on his farm that will provide a model for vibrant, cross-disciplinary, regional, rural food infrastructure. As part of this project, we're planning a state-of-the-art kitchen and restaurant for visiting chefs and teaching spaces and potentially dorm rooms in a future phase, and a living archive that will combine the sort of written history of American poultry farming with the living history of the birds themselves. And we are hard at work bringing this project to life. So the final project that I'll share before I, at long last, stop talking is called the Rwandan Institute for Conservation Agriculture. So this project was founded by an international group of educators who wanted to ensure food sovereignty for the country of Rwanda. As I'm sure many of you know, Rwanda is a very small and landlocked country in Central East Africa. The population of the country is growing very, very quickly after the genocide 25 years ago. And the country is very mountainous. So the mountainous terrain makes deforestation and soil erosion a very difficult thing to combat within the sort of ongoing and ever evolving system of African agricultural techniques. And so the campus is designed from scratch, 1,200 hectares, to raise basically an entire generation of farmers in Rwanda around the idea that human ecological and animal health are inextricably bound to one another, and to teach really long-term, really regenerative farming practices from kind of beginning to end of the food system in order to maintain sovereignty in the country, food sovereignty. So there are a series of enterprises designed onto the campus that are organized around the actual techniques and processes for food production and farming in Rwanda, including all the way through value add harvesting and processing. And this project is under construction right now. There are 56 buildings on this campus, and the first phase is complete. Here in this photo on the right, you see the campus under construction and the very first farm students on site planting the crop. This was about almost a year ago now that the first students were on site. So, the other thing I want to just briefly mention about this project before I wrap up is that it was an opportunity at a very large scale to ask very serious and difficult questions of ourselves about how we could source materials, how we could really bring this conversation about the difference between operational and embodied carbon to bear at a very large scale. So every single material that was designed and specified for every single building on the entire campus went through a very rigorous process of evaluation, supply chain evaluation. Our team developed the first environmental performance metrics that in the country of Rwanda that were sort of setting a standard for material sourcing. And the result of that really rigorous and really difficult process was that about 96% of all the materials on site have been harvested or sourced from within the country. And, we of course we can't design for embodied carbon without asking ourselves some of the questions that I introduced earlier in my presentation about what else is embodied in our design decisions and how we advocate for viable and just and long-term economic growth and change in a country. So that has involved the skills of many local craftsmen and tradesmen who have contributed to the design and construction of the campus. So I'll stop talking, and I'm excited to answer questions or have a discussion. I hope that there are some questions from the audience, but I think that I guess as my closing thought, I want to connect back to the conceptual framework for this work in the context of the world today. So I think that the intersection of food systems and our built environment is really at the vital beating heart, the sort of very core of our many converging planetary crises. And I return to architecture and food again and again as ways of making the invisible visible. So I think it's not too much to ask for the production of our food and the production of our built environment to embody and manifest a particular type of particularly radical hope. So I thought I might just close with the concept of radical hope. So if optimism is too much like pessimism, which is doing nothing and assuming good things will happen, or doing nothing and assuming bad things will happen, then I think radical hope, which is very operative in our work, is this belief that we have the power to affect positive change. We have the power to build just and equitable systems, despite the future, which transcends our, despite an uncertain future, which really transcends our ability to understand what it might be or predict what it might be. So I think that through this work, it's at our tables and in our buildings where we most meaningfully nourish ourselves and each other. And through this architectural practice here, we can make that abundant future irresistible. So that's what I've got. I'm excited to answer questions, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. That was great. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in, or if you prefer, you can put your questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, I can start with questions. First of all, thank you for the lecture. That was obviously really great. And I don't know, these days, it's hard to come across a firm who works like that. Just this is like that precursor to my question. Just like a firm that's a nonprofit like that, that's global, that's so far removed from like the consumer capitalist hyper imaged Instagram architecture world that we're growing up in. So I really appreciate that. My question reflects the lecture back to the curriculum that we have of environments in Cooper. An important figure in our school is Elisa Turbe, who I think you may have gotten.
Yes, I was her TA when we were in grad school. And then we went on to be colleagues and friends. Yeah, of course. That's cool. I didn't know that she was there.
So like her thesis is carbon form, carbon modernity, how the physical form of the world and architecture has been transformed through the energy paradigms of civilization. So reflecting back onto the lecture, at the turning point of the lecture where you began with food and its relation to culture, talk about slow food, the act of eating, cultural memory, people who grew it, regional specificity, and then you transitioned to the idea of slow architecture. The transition seemed metaphorical or maybe metaphysical as opposed to physical and formal. And the way you ended off with the idea of radical hope is also not a physical manifestation, but more of an emotional or a metaphysical relationship between food safety, food production, and architecture being something that's radically formal while it reacts and relates to these metaphysical or non-physical acts in the world. I don't know, I just feel like I would wonder what you think about that aspect of the relationship between food and architecture.
Yeah, I think that if I'm understanding your question, that I work very hard to make that relationship something other than a conceptual argument or a conceptual approach. I think that there is like the energy produced and consumed by our food system and the actual space that it takes up is material, and it is massive. And as I mentioned briefly in the middle of the presentation somewhere, I think, you know, it is like it is invisible by design. So the fact that we can't see it or we don't see it is not an accident. That's on purpose. And so you know, I want to just say that I think first that I actually, you know, I'm teaching a seminar this semester at Cornell, which is also called The Architecture of the Food System. I'm very uncreative with my names, but, you know, that where we are actually building a comprehensive survey of the architecture of the food system in order to map and quantify and survey literally like how much space it takes up and how much energy it uses and how big the buildings are that house the food and how, you know, the supply chains are designed as you know, overly complex and overly segmented things. So I would put that kind of practical, very material, very quantitative intent of mine to understand the architecture of the food system better and deeper in direct conversation with like the project that I shared, the Rwandan Institute for Conservation Agriculture, which is like anything but a metaphorical commitment to this. It is like a really practical commitment to it at an enormous scale, where there was an exhaustive effort done to kind of innovate, to build material supply chains that didn't exist before in service to this idea of an architecture that can only exist here and now and reflects or is like deeply rooted in its time and in its place. So I think that like, you know, I hope that some of the work here showed like a commitment to there. And there are other projects as well that I could use as examples. You know, we have a project in Ilima, deep in the rainforest in Congo, where the entire building was built using man and woman power alone, where like you know, people were harvesting the wood to build the building and carrying it to site on the backs of motorcycles. And so the scale and the design of the building are inherently human and inherently connected to like the world. And so that's another example. And I'm not sure I'm exactly answering your question. And so if you want to ask it again, you definitely can. But I think that like what I want to just emphasize is that like it's not a kind of conceptual argument for us. It's a very practical concern. It's a very it's something that we're very deeply committed to figuring out within and around the existing, you know, the way that we currently produce architecture.
There's a lot of questions in the chat.
I haven't been reading them. Sorry, I can't read and talk at the same time.
I'm just gonna skip to Sarah's question first, just because it's related to doves. She's asking, sorry, how does the form of the architecture or your architecture change or react to the goals of food safety?
This is a very, very topical question. I've been on the phone all week with food safety people and preservation microbiologists and cold storage experts for a project that I can't share too much about yet. But, you know, I think that like, so with this project that I cannot share, that is very ambitious in its scope and something I'm super focused on right now. We are asking ourselves this question all the time. How can the new innovative technologies within a culinary context, you know, within the context of like an innovative restaurant and test kitchen, how can new technologies and new material science, new food safety regulations, all this kind of innovative future-facing stuff be in service to really old techniques, right? How can those tools be applied to a rigorous scientific study of very old techniques for growing food, for preparing food, for preserving food. So based on where I am in the development of that project, I don't have a great answer yet, but I think it's a really excellent question. And, I am really excited in the context of this specific project and also others to test material, if I'm understanding the question correctly, to like test material supply chains and sort of sourcing for that, for a deliberate focus on the contrast between those two things, right? Like new technologies and old techniques. I'm really curious about it. So sorry that I don't have like an answer yet, but I look forward to being able to answer that question like a year from now, really comprehensively.
We have a question from Craig, or two questions. One, do you consider technological approaches to growing food, such as hydro or aquaponics, lab meat, etc., in design? And two, maybe you can touch on this at the end. If interested in exploring the possibility of starting a project, what's the best way to get in touch? Maybe that can be at the end, though.
Sure. So the first part of the question was about technology, about high tech. Sorry, I'm going to.
Yeah, hydro and aquaponics, lab meat, etc.
Okay. Yeah. The political and the political complexity and externalized cost of lab meat, I feel like is something that we maybe don't have time to get into here and now, although it is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I think that my focus on the relationship between our built and unbuilt world as it relates to the production of food is really on a designing resilient and responsive systems that are specifically kind of tailored to the economies and the ecologies in which they exist, right? So I think that there is a place for some of this high-tech innovation that is being done around vertical farming, hydroponics. I would never like sort of discount that within a complicated web of solutions here in the food system, but I do think that like my work is much more specifically focused on the sort of the relationship between rural and urban communities and how that is an infrastructural kind of challenge and what the missing middle scale of agile processing infrastructure is. That like I want to sort of look at the question of architecture and food systems from a territorial or a regional scale. And I think that the hydroponic or vertical farming or kind of high-tech solutions that we see being tested some places is just simply not it's not the answer. And that doesn't mean that there is an answer, because there's a lot of different solutions that are going to come together around rebuilding our food systems, but it's not something that I believe is really going to make as big of an impact as some people think that it will. And I think that the ecological and economic impact of lab meat is really high. So I'm not saying that it's not a viable piece of the puzzle, but it's not as simple for human health or planetary health or animal health as those companies would want you to believe it is.
And the next question is from Sirosh. I don't know if they want to ask it themselves or I can read it. Okay, I'll just
Thanks, Sanjana, and thank you so much, Caitlin. You actually answered the question. It's really about the hydroponics, aquaponics, and aeroponics, but more specifically to the question is really the notion of food miles, and this idea that somehow we're transporting food through ridiculous distances, and we're also not questioning seasons anymore, so you can get any food anytime, all the time. And so the question is more to the point of reducing carbon miles. And with that in mind, do you think there are other ways of growing food in close proximity to cities? Because I think there's like some, and I don't know the numbers and I don't know the science, but there is some talk to suggest that unless you deploy these heavily mechanized systems of aero and aquaponics, you can never reduce carbon miles and feed very dense populations. So just your thoughts on that.
Yes, so I love this question, not because I have a solution, but because I think it's really important to clarify the concept of food miles. So you're absolutely right. The way the industrial system has been built, is so confounding and sort of like outside of what seems reasonable or possible, that you have, wheat that's grown in Kansas, shipped to, trucked to California, shipped to China, processed into cereal, shipped back to Kansas, and, it is wild. So with the understanding that that doesn't make sense, I also think it's really important, that doesn't make sense and also is not a viable long-term solution, right? Like the ecological impact of growing all the wheat that we need in the world, obviously I'm oversimplifying, but like for the sake of the argument, the ecological impact of growing all the wheat that we need in the world in one specific place, and then shipping it all around the world is bad in terms of shipping and bad in terms of the ecological degradation of that monocultural production, right? The amount
Absolutely.
of chemicals and fertilizers that have to be dumped into that soil in order to make that system work is not, like, it literally cannot sustain itself. So when I say it's unsustainable, I mean that it literally cannot sustain itself.
Without doubt.
But, I think the other thing that's important to emphasize is that what we mean when we say local or regional or, food miles, like the 100-mile food diet or whatever, needs to be calibrated to what we're talking about. Like, you might imagine from my lecture that I am like super, uncompromising about things that I'm actually really compromising about. I think that like we cannot expect, we actually in the Northeast, I'm not sure where everybody is physically located right now, but I'm in Connecticut. So here in the Northeast, we have a really amazing ecology for year-round vegan or vegetarian diets. That is like very possible and very achievable for those of us that are, that live in New England. But there are plenty of other places in the world with very different ecologies where that's not possible, or where, veganism is not the most environmentally sound way to eat, because it's much more efficient environmentally to graze beef than it is, to graze cows than it is to try to raise lettuce or grow lettuce. So I think that I totally agree with what's at the core of your question, which is that shouldn't we all be eating seasonally? Absolutely, we should. We should not live in a world where we can go into any grocery store in any part of this country and buy a tomato any time of the year. That is just insane and will end at some point. But what we also have to do is understand that what is considered local or regional is different for a tomato than it is for a grain, or than it is for olive oil, or like, and that our kind of diverse and complex diets are going to be comprised of things that stretch the boundaries of a 100-mile diet, for example. Like, it's just, with a few exceptions, it's just not so possible to be that, to draw that hard line. And I think the same is true in architecture, right? Like, when we think about the supply chain of building materials, we need to have the same kind of critical lens that has a little bit more nuance in it than some of the discourse around like local food or farm to table movement sometimes gives us.
Thank you.
The next question's from Jonathan. I'm curious if you and the rest of the MAS team have seen or investigated synergies between architecture, food, the commons, and non-human agencies, for example, animal pollination. In addition, as a society, we seem to lack the knowledge of where our food is sourced and uneducated about the food we consume. How can we as designers expose this knowledge?
Great questions. So yes, to the first question, we absolutely do design for non-human populations. I think that one of my rallying cries as a educator and as a designer is in trying to break down the boundaries between like hard and soft stuff, for lack of a better term, like the sort of the boundary of an architecture, of a building, of a wall is like totally arbitrary in my mind, right? Because, and this gets at conversations that we don't have to get into now about like the way we use the word Anthropocene and whether that's even the right word, right? It's so human centric. Like, I think that in our design work and in my teaching, what I'm really trying to do is get our work to reflect a sort of equal focus on human and non-human life, and that recognizes non-human intelligence and honors it. So, you know, I guess in terms of our practice, one thing that's interesting to say here is that in terms of our practice, we have a landscape team in-house, which I mentioned. And so we actually do landscape architecture as part of like every single project. You know, it's like a matter of course. We don't do any project without having our landscape experts involved. And the reason for that is that we think that the relationship between architecture and landscape architecture is like unnecessarily kind of hard or bounded. So, you know, there's a lot of specific project examples that I, you know, don't have time to go into about how we do that, but very long answer to a good question, which is like, yes, absolutely. We do think of design in that way. And then the second part of your question I found in the chat window, we lack the knowledge of where our food is sourced and uneducated about the food we consume. How can we as designers expose this knowledge? Yeah, I mean, that is like really basically what I ask myself every morning when I wake up. I think that like the architecture of our food system, as I think I mentioned in the talk, is like designed to be invisible, right? And the reason for that is that, I mean, that's on purpose. It's on purpose that we don't see it, because if we did see it, we would be really, really scared and angry and horrified. And so I think that the kind of fundamental way in which that obfuscation or disguise is accomplished by the industry is by segmenting the system up, dividing the system up into like a million teeny tiny pieces that the relationships between them are confusing and obtuse. And so one of the core principles of my work within the food lab is to start to reconnect these fragmented pieces of the food system, and that is an act of design that is inherently or like intrinsically visible, right? We can like sort of, we can design those new connections, those new interrelationships to be actively visible. And in doing so, they'll start to sort of stitch each other back together, right? So I sometimes get asked like, what does success look like? Which is a really hard question to answer, obviously, because it's not going to be accomplished in my lifetime. But I think that like one of the ways that I try to answer that question is through through education, through more people seeing and understanding their food infrastructure, designing food infrastructure to be visible and legible and at a human scale. So I don't know if that totally answers your question, except just to say that like that is very much the way that I think about all of our work, and hope that all of our work is doing in different ways and at different scales.
I have a question. I feel it's a little bit cliche to ask this, but I will anyway. In relation to COVID, like you talked a little bit about the idea of slowness and the kind of slowness of traditional food-related practices in contrast to the speed of industrialization. And I'm curious if your practice in any way has changed, or you've seen your relationship to design change because of the pandemic, because we have kind of been forced to slow down, and we've kind of had to contend with our domesticities in a very new and different way that we haven't had to do before.
I love that question, and I wish that I could answer it differently than I can. My work, because of the because of our focus as a firm on the relationship between architecture and human health, and because of a lot of our work that's based in like literally like infectious disease control in indoor air environments, our work has only gotten busier and crazier since the pandemic. Specifically in regards to my food lab portfolio, I've also had a lot of projects and partners that have needed urgent support as the brittle industrial food system has kind of collapsed in various ways, big and small, in front of our eyes. So I have not had the opportunity to slow down, is basically what I mean to say. And but what I have done and will continue to do is focus very intentionally on like being present on my farm, right? Like I have the amazing benefit, the amazing privilege of being quarantined with my husband and my son on our farm. And I'm able to grow our food and eat our food just as I have every other year before the pandemic. So I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for that because, but I was grateful for it before the pandemic too. So I think like many of you, probably my work habits have gotten very strange in the pandemic, and I cannot even count the number of hours I've been on Zoom today. But I would, as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm always looking these days, especially to figure out ways of sort of grounding ourselves and connecting with each other on this horrible platform. And so, I'm very grateful to opportunities like this to do that. But I think that like the slowness of our work has, the slowness of our architecture has not been reflected in any kind of slowness in our work.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think we have a question from Alex next.
Hi, Caitlin. You had mentioned this idea of technocratic solutions versus place-based perennial solutions. And I was curious about how that related to permaculture design and smaller scale family farms. If permaculture design is something that's considered at MAS or in your own practice.
Absolutely. I think that perennial and permacultural agriculture is critical and urgent. We're working in partnership. It's an early partnership, which is why I didn't include it in the presentation, but working in partnership with Wes Jackson at the Land Institute. I don't know if you know him, but he's an amazing, he's like I'm like his #1 fan. But he's a scientist, he's a botanist, and he created this organization called the Land Institute about 40 years ago, also out in Kansas, around the simple idea that we needed to breed perennial grains, that we could, as botanists, as plant breeders, we could genetically breed grain plants to grow year after year within the native prairie habitat, and that was maybe the only way at this point of regenerating or restoring the altered landscape of corn and soy production in the Midwest. And so that's just one example of how not only do we like think about it in terms of our design work project to project, but we also are partnering with people that are pioneering like large scale solutions to that as a large scale strategies to that as a solution. So yes, absolutely, very much front of mind.
And sort of related, you had mentioned a different team of landscape architects at MAS versus, I guess, traditional building architects. Do you see permaculture being more, I guess, added to the mix of landscaping, in a sense of you have a space, looking at the region, like before you put anything in, taking a look at how something might live on as well as the building in the plant world?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we don't design any landscape without without doing that. That's sort of, it's like the baseline for our landscape work. Yeah, in all contexts.
Thank you.
Caitlin, thank you so much for your presentation. I think a lot of what you're saying kind of can get lost in the detail, or I'm hoping for more detail to be able to understand what your project in Senegal. And just to contextualize my question, I want to tell a little story. So I have a farmer friend in Colombia, and he wants to get into quinoa, farming quinoa, and he thought it was very difficult, and he was ready to quit. But he's really into indigenous culture and ceremonies, and finally he was able to connect with an elder from Peru who taught him how a couple of ceremonies and traditions around quinoa and how to harvest it in a ceremonial way. And when he learned the dance, because it goes with a dance, he was able to sustain his effort and be able to harvest quinoa and continue his work. Now, that's my understanding of technology, local technique or skill sets that have survived a withdrawal and that continue, and that could continue to withdraw if new technologies come in. Now, I'm trying to understand how your work in Senegal would sustain slow agriculture, slow food, and also the traditions and the technologies that are local to Senegal.
Yeah, thank you. So that project is really interesting because what we are challenging ourselves with and our partners with is reconciling exactly that tension that you've described. Like, how can middle scale industrial tools enable or sustain or sort of like stabilize really volatile economic conditions in a place like the Sahel. So, and so the reason why they're focusing specifically on fonio as a grain is because it is very drought tolerant. It can grow, in a range of contexts as the environment continues to change in that region. And there is a limit to the amount that can be processed by hand. And so by introducing this middle scale industrial mill, they are able to continue to grow the fonio industry, continue to grow more fonio in the region, but do so in a way that is specifically designed around the interests of smallholder farmers. So it's accompanied with like the formation of collectives where smallholder farmers that are growing very small amounts of grain by themselves are able to aggregate and participate in the marketplace at the sort of middle industrial scale, and that's actually kind of protecting and stabilizing the agricultural sort of history of that region. So it's a really interesting question, and like I think it sort of remains to be seen, honestly, whether it's successful, but that's the intent, is to be really intentional about that.
Caitlin, I have a question for you. I am an educator, and in addition, I'm taking my second master's at the University of Florida in pedagogy in architecture. Before this, I was a chef for 20 years. And so my interests lie inherently in the crux of food and the built environment. And I'm writing my master's for this program on that intersection. And I come across a lot of difficulty in how to present this, in how to present it to the food world and how to present it in the education world to architectural students. Of course, I come up a lot with not only design issues, but also experiential issues, ideas of memory, all over the place. It could go in so many directions. But how do you focus your experience and your thoughts into education, not only in the food world, but in the built environment as well? Like, what is the best mix you find there? It's kind of a large question, I understand.
Yeah, I think that I have obviously like a unique perspective because I come to my teaching, my pedagogy with like a sort of different vocabulary around this stuff than some people do, because I also, I'm a farmer. And so I think maybe if I'm understanding your question correctly, what I try to do is challenge my students to, sorry, my phone is ringing on my computer, challenge my students to like speak to non-architects, right? Basically at the like most basic level. So because I work so closely with chefs, because I am a farmer, because I am an architect, I find that like, not that I'm like perfect at it, but I am able to kind of navigate conversations with lots of different audiences and find common ground, find like shared vocabulary. And that's something that I think is really, really important for students to learn. So like, in my studio at Cornell this semester, we are working directly with chefs, and they have to present their design work to those chefs. Like, it's not enough to present their design work to architects. They have to actually present their projects to farmers and chefs. And if they can't explain it clearly to those guys who are brilliant but not architects, then they haven't yet figured out, they haven't rehearsed enough how to find that common ground. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but that's my kind of like pedagogical approach, is that like we just really, really have to, as architects, get better at talking to non-architects or talking to people other than ourselves. And so I take that on as a really like active part of my teaching, where I invite entire juries of non-architects and ask my students to like convince them of their design ideas. And if they can do that, then I've been successful.
And there seems to, obviously we know that in the food world, there is often a gap between production and consumption. Could architecture, there's probably the same gap there as well. Do you think that the education students can help to meet with that?
Oh, I hope so. Yeah. I mean, I think that like, yeah, I think just like that's my sort of broad opinion of architectural education, is that we should all be practicing, and the profession, education and the profession, that like we as a profession have to get better at talking to people that are not within our industry. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, my hope would be that rehearsing that in the context of my studio is good practice for my students.
Yeah, thanks.
Caitlin, are you okay to do 2 more questions? I realize we're approaching 8. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, I can do 2 more. I can hear my son running around out there. He's ready for dinner.
Lionel, feel free to go ahead.
Thank you very much for the lovely presentation. I had a quick question with the idea of scalability of your work, in that it does question the importance we place upon efficiency of the current food system. Is there the hope that by introducing architecture that's conscious of a region, that it acts as an emblem for people to change about how they consume things, and essentially our comfort, and change what we expect we can get all year round? For example, at the supermarket, do you feel that there is a scalability to the idea that you can go by region that's managed on a bigger sphere, that everyone finds common ground, as you'd earlier mentioned? Or is that kind of a region like word of mouth kind of thing that will spread more slowly, and no corporate idea could take a hold of it, therefore limiting its economic viability in this world?
Yeah, I think it must be possible. I think we don't have a choice. We don't have any other options on the like 50 to 100 year timeline. So I think that figuring out how to so a regional food system is inherently bounded and acknowledgent of limits, right? Like we, in terms of our built environment, in terms of the sort of capitalism, not to like end on too strong of a note, but like, you know, capitalism is founded on the idea that infinite growth is possible, right? Which we know it's not. So that's what I always come back to. Like, we live on a planet. The planet is a certain size. It has so much water and so much air. So it's like, by definition, not infinite. And, you know, Naomi Klein has that great line about only one of those things can be changed, and it's not the laws of nature. And so I, you know, I come back to that when we question scale. Like, we have no choice but to design these systems to be scaled, and that's going to mean different things in different places. You know, as I was talking about before, what we define as regional is going to be different, whether we're talking about the Northeast, whether we're talking about South America, whether we're talking about, you know, the Sahel in Senegal, but we have to kind of I'm interested in like projects that are catalysts, right? Or sometimes we call them lighthouses, like projects that like go way far out into the fog and then guide us in the right direction. That's like a different way of asking about scale, and I think one that is like a sort of better challenge for our practice. It's not like, how can we make our architecture bigger? It's like, how can we pull the entire system in a direction that is bounded and that is finite. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you.
Following up on that, sort of a similar question, have you at MAS like faced a lot of pushback from clients or from like a general culture and architecture against trying to focus on provenance design instead of performance design? And also, has that pushback, if any, been more from the architectural side of the projects or from the non-architectural, possibly, or even like from corporate interests that you aren't necessarily working to please? Like, I feel like the general impression I would have is that maybe 20 years ago, performance design would have been seen as the only option. And today, perhaps more people are considering something like provenance design. But how much do you feel like the industry has changed or started to recognize this new type, or like this alternative type of design?
Yeah, I think that we are at the very early stages of it, but it's very different depending on where you are in the world, right? So we've had a ton of success in like in our African practice, asking really hard questions and coming up with really creative solutions, because the supply chain and procurement systems for the construction of buildings is just like very different than it is in the United States. And so, you know, the answer to your question varies a lot depending on where we're talking about. But I think that that you're absolutely right, that it is hugely, hugely hard here in the United States to start to introduce these ideas. And partner by partner, or client by client, or project by project, we are finding ways to do that. You know, I'm working with a partner now with whom we are trying to grow all the building materials for a specific project. You know, that's like pretty serious outside the box work, but like would not be possible. We all know that it would not be possible in like you know, 99.9% of projects in the US. And so I think my kind of roundabout answer to your question is that we are just looking for individual opportunities to answer those questions project by project. And so it may be very small victories or it may be very big ones, but like we're trying to nudge, right? We're trying to like nudge partners and clients towards an understanding of what's viable. And honestly, we're trying to nudge partners and clients towards new and expanded definitions of value, right? Like, which is especially hard within the commercial real estate and development world. But I think because it's especially hard there, it's especially important that we try, you know, to bring in a definition of value that accounts for economic and environmental and sort of cultural value as much as money or profit.
Thank you.
I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for joining us and for answering all those questions.
Yeah, thanks everybody. It's been such a pleasure to see all of you. I wish that we were going to go out to whatever that bar was called now, but I will do so in spirit. And yeah, thanks everybody for having me. It was really fun. Nice to see you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.